Thank you very much. This is another video in the series Mind Opening Dialogue. Here I'm focusing on development across stages or phases or levels. So you're familiar with the notion of vertical development. So we are not just acquiring more skills on a horizontal change, typing skills, maybe another language, but we are also growing vertically, gaining more complexity, having more perspectives. And you can, if you want, describe this development as just using one line or one language. So if you're familiar with the language of spiral dynamics, if you're familiar with the model of Robert Keegan, the model of Susan Cook-Reuter, Jane Livinger, they are, if you read them in a simplistic way, they could be understood in a way that all development is just there together, and people are kind of stepping ahead or beyond each level after the other with all their capacities. And then there are other people who say, well, that's a bit tricky. Ken Wilbers uses the metaphor of lines, so having different lines in parallel. So, and they are distinguishing, for example, the cognitive line, the socio-emotional line, the worldview line. And there are others who say, okay, there is a moral line, a spiritual line, an aesthetic line, a kinesthetic line, etc. Here on Mind Opening Dialogue, we are focusing on the first three lines that I mentioned. So cognitive, socio-emotional, and worldview. And for the cognitive development, I'm using the model of hierarchical complexity, Michael Commons, as a scaffolding. I'm using the model of Bob Keegan, mainly for the socio-emotional identity development. And I'm using spiral dynamics and familiar material for the worldview line. And of course, it would be nice if we and others would kind of progress beyond these different stages on these lines in parallel, but sometimes that's just not the case. And there is this notion of Ken Wilber who says that the cognitive line is the highest. So if you're not very mature in the cognitive line, this kind of hinders you to develop on the other lines beyond this level, beyond the cognitive level. Yes, and I'm not so sure. I think this is a nice hypothesis, and it helps me to kind of check when I'm together with people, with coachees. Is this true here in this case? What we do know, of course, is that there are many people out there who are really very developed in their cognitive line, so they can think in a very complex way. It's not just about IQ, of course. It's really about having different perspectives. Are you able to see things in motion and not just static, in front of a context and not just alone, being related in some kind of transformation to a higher level? So this question of polarity thinking comes in, etc. So there are people who really are very good in these aspects, but they're not so good in socio-emotional terms. And they're also quite conservative, maybe, in their worldview, having problems to integrate diversity, for example. So this would be an example of a person who is higher on the cognitive level and not so much developed on the other lines. We seem to have also examples of people who are socio-emotionally mature, if you want, but who are cognitively not so developed. And I have been wondering a lot about these people. And what is it? Are they really socio-emotionally mature? And then I was more and more thinking, well, they have good skills, many of them, good listening skill, very empathetic, etc. But if we look closer and try to understand their perspectives, so when we're talking about maturity on socio-emotional identity line, then we're really talking about, do I have different perspectives? Can I take perspectives others than mine? Can I kind of empathize with others from their perspective? And how do I handle tensions of meaning making Then sometimes the maturity, allegedly maturity, is not so deep. So it looks very socio-emotionally skilled, but I'm not so sure, at least, if it's really possible to be ahead of the cognitive line with your socio-emotional line. I'm very skeptic. About the worldview line, there I'm very convinced that it's possible to kind of acquire the language of your surrounding. So our children have acquired the language of green, if you want, very early, around the age of 12 or so. Because of course, this is the language that we're hearing in our house. It's about diversity, etc. But cognitively, they were not at the corresponding cognitive or socio-emotional level. Of course not, 12 years. So it's possible to be ahead in the worldview line in comparison to the other lines, of course, because people just acquire the language and the values of their contexts. There is a tension then, of course, if people are very ahead on their cognitive line, and sometimes I'm smiling because some people who are stressing the importance to differentiate between the cognitive line and socio-emotional line, for example, sometimes I'm having the assumption they're doing this because they themselves are more mature in the cognitive than on the socio-emotional line. Yeah, that's just a private hypothesis here. How can we support people in their development? And my assumption is, and of course others say that too, that what we can do is we can work and support people on the cognitive line. This is possible. We don't have very good data on whether it's possible to coach people to kind of grow on the socio-emotional line. Is this really possible? My experience is we can, of course, use the cognitive material to support people in this respect, and then a bit of camouflage way, guerrilla, we're using, or I'm using, cognitive material approaches, and there are skills there, and implement these thinking procedures into the socio-emotional sphere. So polarity thinking applied to the socio-emotional sphere, perspective taking, contexts, being in relation, etc. So using these abstract concepts that people maybe have just applied for understanding the outside reality, and applying the same approaches that they are already quite familiar with to apply it on their interior reality, having more complexity, seeing more identities, getting more distance from oneself. So this is the way we here try to support development on the cognitive line, but also on the socio-emotional line. The worldview line is really, I think, very context specific. In most Western countries, if you want to have some influence here and some, if you want to contribute to the development of society, of organizations, etc., I would say it's really important to have an integral worldview. Integral meaning integrating what is helpful from the lower, if you want, lower value spheres. So integrating healthy, if you're using the colors of spiral dynamics, healthy beige, so the healthy archaic things where we are connected to our body and we are integrating the basic needs that we as humans and also as animals really have. So valuable things from the beige sphere, archaic, valuable elements from the tribal sphere, purple, so we are connected to everything, valuable aspects of the red phase, of the warrior phase, the courage aspect, integrating valuable elements also from the blue sphere, so about what is order, having some kind of security, stability, and of course integrating valuable elements from the orange, efficiency, effectiveness, innovation, numbers, etc., scaling, and of course integrating valuable elements from the green sphere, pluralistic, where it's about diversity and the soft aspects of our relations. So this integral perspective, I think, is really helpful and necessary to kind of integrate and communicate, coordinate people on different value levels and weave together a carpet of meaning and sense making. Thank you very much for your interest in the mind-opening dialogue. Would be nice if you would get in contact and give your feedback, whether you think that this approach is helpful. See for more details on mindopenness.net, and there's also the access to the Sutro platform. Thank you.